Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to acknowledge the struggle and dignity of freedom for the Black and African communities, and it is overseen by the Amistad Committee. The Freedom Trail officially opened September 1996 with 50 sites in 50 towns. Today, we're at 170 sites and still growing. Today, we are going to be joined by John Mills. But before we see John, a little housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will make sure we answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Also, we have a survey. Please let us know what you would like to see and let us know how we are doing. Now, back to our speaker. John Mills, he is originally from San Diego. He is a technologist by trade, but an equity advocate, an independent scholar, as well as a genealogist and a historian. The descendant of the enslaved, as well as descendant of enslavers due to their forced relationships with the enslaved. John focuses on unearthing little known people and stories of this country's history in chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. John's goal is to honor the forgotten as well as to apply critical thinking to our history, as well to our American history and the ripple effects of slavery today. So, John, welcome.
I appreciate it, Tammy. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate you giving me the time. It's awesome. And yeah, I guess I'll just dive right into it. And just so that you know, my presentations, I tend to start with an introduction of who I am and then why I do my work, my own genealogy, tying myself to the stories of the actors, the folks that I'm talking about, because I think a lot of times we look at these historical topics and we don't associate ourselves to them. So I tend to try to associate myself to it, and hopefully the audience will too. So that's what I'm going to do. So again, as Tammy said, my name is John Mills, originally from San Diego, California. I moved to Connecticut in 1998, and although I'm a technologist and have worked as a software architect for many decades, I identify mostly as a husband, father, grandfather. My personal and family role. I started this work because I grew up on the West Coast at a turbulent time, and my father was very aggressive about ensuring that I didn't see myself or belittle myself or see myself as less than anyone else. But for whatever reason, that didn't stick. When I got to be a young adult in the late 80s, early 90s, I reflected and recognized that I was actually doing just that. I actually had biases against my own self and held white America as of much more value than I. And I don't know where that came from, but I knew I didn't want my daughter to do the same. So I started kind of working to kind of give her that level of pride in herself and hopefully affect the outside world that I believe was affecting me to have the position I had. So that's where my work started. My sister got me into genealogy. She was researching my family, and she brought me some information that I hadn't seen before in the 90s. I knew my grandfather. He's on the left there. He died in 1987. I knew him really well. He's my father's father. She started doing genealogy. He never talked to us much about his roots in Texas, but my sister discovered that his mother, her name was Eliza Mills. She died in the 1918 flu pandemic, and my grandfather's grandfather, his name was Ned Mills, was an enslaved person in Texas. That's the highlight around the boxes. Those will be enslaved people as we walk through the slides. And I was fascinated by that. I had never tied. I knew I was African American in America. I likely had a tie to slavery, but I had actually never seen the evidence of it. And now we had a death certificate of my grandmother, Eliza Mills, and we knew where my family in Texas were buried based on that death certificate. So we decided to travel to Texas to find this cemetery that's listed on the death certificate. When we arrived in Texas, we quickly realized that cemetery was actually a whites only cemetery, and we had to walk behind that cemetery to find my ancestors in the woods. And so that was a sobering reality for me. That one, my surname of Mills was just the last name of the last enslaver of my second great grandfather, and two, that my ancestors were a part of this demeaning in life and death. So that sparked more interest. My sister, then gave me some more information about my father's mother. Her name was Annie Idell Fuller. I knew her extremely well. She died in 1998. I didn't know a whole lot about her family either. I knew her mother, my great grandmother. I was alive and she died in '84, so I knew her really well. But I knew nothing other than that. What I learned through my sister's research is that my great grandmother, Tony Lee Kyle, who again I knew, her parents were both enslaved. And not only that, her mother was the product of a rape by an enslaver and his enslaved, which would be my second great grandmother, Marguerite, who was a native of Africa, who was purchased by John and Keziah White to Irish immigrants who purchased her for slave labor. And so that was stunning to me. Now I realized I had like this relationship, genealogical relationship, not only to the enslaved, but to the enslavers as well through that rape. Also, on the other side of that, my great grandmother's father was enslaved to a man by the name of Claiborne Kyle, who was a politician in Mississippi and in Texas. And they also do the same thing. They had rapes with their enslaved. So on this other side of that, I was also a descendant of the slave and the enslaver. So we wanted to go see those locations too. Well, where were these people buried? So we took a trip there just recently, and I found Kyle Cemetery, and I see all the enslaver and their descendants. Often that, and where I'm standing in this picture is at the enslaver's stone. His name was Claiborne Kyle, but you'll see a tree line behind me. Off in those woods is where I then found my descendants. So it was like a similar scenario. Now I found down two lines where there's this distinction between value and where my descendants were being buried. And and not only in that, they're stones, right? Most of the time there weren't stones, or they were very poorly made stones that had withered. And so I got to see that firsthand. My sister, then we went to my maternal side and tracked my mother's father. And as my grandfather, John Smith, he was a Navy man all of his life, and we're very proud of it. But little did he know, he died in 2007. Little did he know that his great grandfather was also in the Navy. And my sister discovered that through her research. His name was William Cooper. William Cooper was not only in the Navy, he served in the Civil War, served on 3 separate ships. One of those ships was a Confederate ship that had been obtained by the Union and then recommissioned as the Union ship. And he served on that ship. We have his records of post the Civil War of applying for his pension. Sadly, after he died, his widow tried to get his pension. It took her many, many years to get that. But we wanted to then see, well, where is he buried? He was from Baltimore. We knew of Loudon Cemetery in Baltimore, which is a military cemetery. Turns out he wasn't buried there. He was buried at Laurel Cemetery, which was an African-American cemetery at the time in Baltimore. So he wasn't buried with the people he served with. And Laurel Cemetery was paved over in 1957. So there's 30,000 African Americans under this parking lot. So when we were there, we ended up just taking a picture in this parking lot because my third great grandfather is somewhere under there. Which started another effort of mine to try to figure out how to get him a stone at the actual military cemetery in Baltimore. So all of this drove me towards much more work, an intent to use this information to really highlight the common person. Like I spent most of my life learning about, the people that the school systems allowed to be presented. Like I would learn about Martin Luther King, or I'd learn about Rosa Parks. I'd learn about Harriet Tubman, the exceptionalists, right? And I never really learned about the ordinary person, the million, not the one, the people that were in the trenches, that grinded and were heroes to me because they persisted, right? Those were the people that I was related to that ended up lost under parking lots and in woods. So I started an effort to try to highlight those people in my research, use that as a sense of, and a mechanism to provide pride in our staple within this country, and also to see if I can get those that hear these stories and hear my relationship to them to reflect and interrogate how they're presenting in the world, and maybe that might affect unconsciousness of bias. So that's what I did here in Connecticut. I found a story a few years ago after reading a book by a man by the name of Richard Phelps. It was about the book is about Newgate Prison, right? It's about the prison in East Granby. But in that book, because he's writing about the prison back in 1844, a gentleman by the name of Prince Mortimer had been a prisoner there. So there's a couple of paragraphs about this former enslaved man. In that paragraph, it talks about how he was a native of Guinea, Africa. It talks about how he ends up dying at 110 years old at a prison in Wethersfield, Connecticut. It talks about how his complexion did not, at the least, belie his name, for surely he was the personification of darkness visible, basically saying he was just really, really black. It talks about how he was purchased by the Mortimer family, Philip Mortimer in Middletown, and how he worked at a rope walk, and how he served in the Revolutionary War and was servant to many officers, including General George Washington. And then it talks about how he had attempted to poison his master at the age of 87. Hadn't received his freedom, after the Revolutionary War, and and he's 87. He's been enslaved pretty much all of his life since he was a kid, and so he attempts to poison his master. Then he goes to jail for life. And at the end of this paragraph in the book, it says, and in prison ends his unhappy years. And there's these couple paragraphs, and that's it. Well, I was intrigued. I wanted to know more about this Connecticut enslaved man, and what does his story, what is of his story? Where was he buried? Is it like my family, where you can't find it? So I wanted to know more. So I started digging into that, and I found another book by a gentleman by the name of Dennis Caron, who he wrote a book about it in 2006, right? So some 160 years after that original book that had a couple paragraphs about him, and a gentleman writes a full book about him. And in this book, Dennis Caron, what I found most intriguing was he starts the book by referencing those couple of paragraphs in the former book by Richard Phelps, indicating that's how he came to the story as well. And he states that, frankly, talking about the previous book, the passage did not make any particular impression on me at the first reading. The appeal of Prince's story struck me only after I reflected over the dates that Phelps mentions. Prince died in 1834 at the stated age of 110. And that struck me, that when this gentleman read the book, what struck him was how old Prince was when he died. But that's not what had struck me, which was a little bit different, which kind of gets me to where I think the perspective of descendants of the enslaved might see things a little bit different based on what my exposure was, what my upbringing was, and what I saw relative to my own descendants. What struck me in the story were, one, where is he buried? Right? I was going, there's a lost cemetery here. I don't know where he's at. Similar to my experience with my family. Two, they have a colorism instance in that initial statement that talks about how black he is. And that resonated with me because my father actually was very fair skinned. And so in the area where we grew up, that was an issue. And commonly in our area of the country, if you were too dark, that was an issue. There was always this colorism thing. So that struck me. Trauma struck me of my experience in kind of finding out what happened with my family. And there was a sense of loss when I was figuring that out, and where my last name came from. And in this story, there was that trauma. That struck me. The lack of documentation struck me. Like, I can't find anything other than these couple, references 160 years apart about this individual. And the fact that he was incarcerated, which speaks to a larger kind of topic within the African-American experience. So those were the things that struck me. Whereas the writer, what struck him was he was 110 years old, which I wanted to dig into that more. So I started doing a little more research. I started reading and digging into the book by Dennis Caron, the second book from 2006. And I got some more details. In his book, he talks about how in 1794, the enslaved prince was to be freed by the enslaver, Philip Mortimer. Philip Mortimer had written a will, and he was going to free him. But in 1795, after the enslaver passes away, the son-in-law and daughter-in-law of that enslaver, their names were George and Ann Starr, they contest the will because in the will was giving property, money, and freedom to these enslaved people. And so the son-in-law and daughter would have lost out. So they challenge the will, and the will is overturned. They end up being the recipient of all of the enslaved and the money and the wealth. And so instead of being freed in 1794, Prince Mortimer ends up now enslaved to the son-in-law and daughter, becoming property of them in 1796. And so that added another element to the story, right? It's like he was supposed to be freed after the Revolutionary War and was not. Now he's supposed to be freed at the death of his enslaver, and he's 70 years old at this time, right? And he's supposed to be freed. That doesn't happen, and now he's enslaved to the son-in-law. And so some 15 years later, that's when there's this accusation that he has attempted to poison the son-in-law. He's 87 years old now, right? Like trying to finally get his freedom. And so that whole nother spin on the story, once I kind of understood it from that perspective. He's then sent to Newgate Prison, considered one of the worst prisons in America at the time. Prisoners were held underground. It was an iron mine, and so you're underground in this mine. And so it was considered a dangerous place. You know, there was no guards down there, so it was kind of free reign when you were down there in that mine. And so he's there until 1827, and then they closed that prison because of the upkeep of it, and they move him to a new prison that was created in Wethersfield in 1827. And there in 1827, he stays incarcerated until 1834, and he dies in Wethersfield. And then based on my additional kind of research, I learned that he supposedly was buried at the prison cemetery in Wethersfield, which would be under Cove Park. The actual prison was where the Department of Motor Vehicles currently sits in Wethersfield, and the Cove Park is right next door. So I realized, you know, this is good information, but now I want to really dive into what did they miss? What's more here that I can kind of pull from the story? So I spent some time kind of digging into that. And what I've learned over the years in digging into these stories is you have to start with the enslaver, because they didn't really, you know, document the enslaved well. So it's kind of a sting that you have to go so deep into an enslaver's life, kind of hoping that they reference, you know, the African American that you're looking for, so that you have this like crumb of information. But that's the process. So I started digging into the enslaver, Philip Mortimer, looking for references to Prince Mortimer. And in doing so, I started with, okay, when did he get to the country? I realized in my research that first references of him are in Boston. He lived in Boston in 1737. So he came in through the Boston colony, in the Massachusetts colony, sometime before that. I'm not quite sure exactly when, but I know sometime before 1737. I know that he married Martha Blinn in 1742 in Boston. I learned that Martha Blinn was actually from Wethersfield, and she was from an incredibly wealthy family. One of the initial founders of Wethersfield she's related to, and they own property across the Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay colonies. So I think she was just up there visiting, but she was actually born, raised in Wethersfield, and had family in Middletown, which then explains why I then find Philip and Martha living in Middletown just 3 years later. And they seemed well established in Middletown in 1745. So sometime, probably right after 1742, their marriage, they moved to Middletown. I see that because I find a will of an individual who lives in Middletown, and Philip Mortimer is a witness to that will in Middletown. And so I learned in a lot of other research that I'm not going to present here. A lot of this is on my website, alexbrienne.org, if you'd like to see it. But I learned more and more depth about who Philip Mortimer is. I learned when he buys the property to build his rope walk in in Middletown, a rope walk being a facility where you make rope and those ropes are used on ships, right? It's very grueling work. And that's where Prince Mortimer worked, at this rope walk. Um, and he buys that property in 1754. Sometime, around that time, he purchases Prince Mortimer. We don't know exactly when, but sometime, after 1754, he purchases Prince Mortimer. So then I start digging into well, who are there other relatives of Philip Mortimer that may have owned him, uh, that he was purchased from? And I found some information that I don't think had ever been uncovered before, and that is that Philip Mortimer came to this country not alone. He came with his two brothers and his sister-in-law. I found this because I saw in a Connecticut Current, which is now the Hartford Current, back in 1773, an article listing that Philip Mortimer's two brothers, his older brother James and his younger brother Peter, and Jane's wife Hannah, all had died within a week of each other in Boston, under the same roof. So it sounds like it must have been some type of illness that they all caught, and smallpox or something like that. So they all died within a week of each other. Interestingly enough, they all died 4 months prior to the Boston Tea Party, in Boston. And also interesting enough, I also went and looking for more information about these individuals. I went and visited their grave site. I learned over the years that a lot of times you can find different information on stones or who's buried around those individuals. So I went to Copp's Hill Cemetery in Boston and found their headstones. I didn't get a lot off of them or the area around them, but what I did find is that many of the participants of the Boston Tea Party are also buried right around Philip Mortimer's family. So like these people that Prince Mortimer was enslaved to were very involved in the country's beginnings, and they're tied to a lot of critical events. I then started digging more into like what was Philip Mortimer's role in Middletown, and I learned that he was a part of the instantiation of the Episcopal Church in Middletown, erecting their first house of worship and purchasing the property that church sat on, which is interesting to me because as you dig into the enslaved, you often learn that what's common about slavery and religion is that the enslaver used religion to keep the enslaved um, adamant and okay with their station, right? They would use Bible verses to tell them you're supposed to be a slave. You're not supposed to be pushing back. You're supposed to be accepting this. This is God's will. If you go against it, you're going against God. So then you kind of understand that this enslaver is kind of core to the Episcopal Church as well. It's in kind of initiating its rector. I found interesting about that. He also, the enslaver, was heavy into politics in Middletown. He was an alderman, and later on he's a selectman. But not only him, the son-in-law, George Starr, was a councilman. And later on, during the Revolutionary War, he also supplied boots to the forces. There's even a letter from George Washington at the National Archives that was sent to George Starr, the son-in-law, requesting additional boots. He was the quartermaster for Connecticut. So now I'm learning that not only are they heavy with regards to religion in Middletown, but they're heavy as it relates to politics in Middletown, these enslavers of Prince Mortimer. Additionally, I learned that Philip Mortimer also was a heavy donor to the first courthouse ever erected in Middletown. And not only Philip Mortimer, but the son-in-law was also, they are the largest, amongst the largest of the donors to the funds used to build the initial courthouse. So now that's like the trifecta, like they're heavy in initiating the initial church, Episcopal Church there. They're heavy into politics. And the legal system in developing the courthouse there, they're heavy have heavy influence. So those are like to me, those are critical elements to what would happen and what place and what room the enslaved really had in that location in Middletown. Um, I found I become, when I start digging into these participants, these individuals, I tend to, like, grab as much as I can. Later on, I might find why something I grabbed tied or not. I had purchased an 1895 book about Newgate Prison, just to kind of get an idea of what was that prison like. It's like the oldest book I could find that had imagery of that prison. It's long after it closed down, right? It closed down in 1827, but it's as close as I can get to have an image to what it looked like back there in those underground caverns. And in that book, it had this imagery. The prisoners would sleep on beds of hay on rocks, right? And they had to climb down this 50-foot ladder, which you kind of see in the middle of that image. And also at the beginning of my slide, I'm actually in this location, looking up in that well where this ladder used to be. And so it kind of gives you an idea of an 87-year-old man coming here and then having to sleep in these conditions underground. They built above ground cells 4 years after he got there. So I'm assuming 4 years in, they probably didn't have to, send him down there. Like by the time he's 91, I'm assuming he was sleeping above ground. But when he first got there, this is where he would have been. I found additional documents that I don't think had ever been uncovered. They were at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts. It was the medical ledger of the attending physician of the hospital of Wethersfield Prison for the periods between 1829 and 1831. What's interesting about these documents that I find is during that time, the warden was being investigated for a mistreatment of the prisoners, malnourishment. Some had died, and so and they were being fed poison or food that was contaminated. The well they were drinking out of smelled, and it was contaminated by lots of things. One of which was dead bodies that they were leaving in the basement, and those were being eaten by rats, and the foils of that was getting into the well. And so during that time, I was able to see these records that I had discovered where Prince, his nickname was Guinea, was complaining of a bowel pain, and he had been sent to the hospital for this. And the prescription by that doctor was, well, you guys need to feed him better food, right? And so it allowed me to see that Prince was now not only incarcerated, but he was now a part of this larger Connecticut issue where there was like an investigation into the Wethersfield prison as to how they were treating inmates. And he was suffering from that. So that was interesting to me. Also, I was now also trying to figure out, like, where is Prince? Right? Where did he get buried? I know there's that cemetery right next to Cove Park. And there's a plaque there that says he was buried there. But in talking with one of the historians in Wethersfield, Connecticut, he told me, John, I don't think he's buried there. And he says, they used to send bodies to Yale. And so everybody wasn't buried here. And so I started digging into that. I contacted Tammy Denise of the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and she got me in contact with individuals at Yale, and we started doing some research. I also discovered an article and a book that talks about in 1824, a white woman in West Haven, her name was Bathsheba Smith, had passed away, was buried, and Yale students, which they did often, this wasn't an unusual thing, not even to Connecticut, it was across the world at that time, the turn of the century, from early 1800s. Medical students would go to grave sites and dig up bodies, and they would use those for dissection and experimentation. Most of the time, they were homeless people or minorities and people that they felt weren't valued to society. So no one complained. But then in this scenario, Bathsheba Smith was a young white woman, so the town rioted for days relative to that occurring. The constable went to Yale Medical School and discovered Bathsheba Smith's body hidden under floorboards. And as soon as that occurred, the governor, recognizing there's an issue here, the Yale Medical School needs bodies, but they can't just be digging up bodies out of cemeteries. So they pass an act that changes that. It makes it illegal to dig up a body from a graveyard. But if you die at a prison, at the state prison particularly, which is where Prince was, then that body can go to the School of Medicine, which would have been Yale. And so that this article aligned to what that historian told me. And so I started trying to find the paper trail. I have no documentation of ever being buried there. So, and we have documentation of others, but not him. And so we haven't found a paper trail yet, but myself and individuals at Yale all ultimately agree that he was likely not buried at Cove Park. He was likely sent to Yale for dissection. And so now, after real understanding and getting all this information, there's more to this story that that resonates with me, right? My purview, my perspective, my life experience, the things I saw and the things that are aligned to my genealogy that I saw, make this story and that first couple paragraphs that I read in Richard Phelps' book say a few more things now, right? We talked about lost cemeteries, colorism, trauma, lack of documentation, incarceration. But now I had, based on the enslaver's story, I had generational wealth, right? I had political influence. I had inequities in healthcare. I had inequities in medical research, right? And I probably can add a few more things to this, but it made me realize that Prince's story is a broader story about elements of society of the time that really were in your face, but still exist today. We still talk about these same inequities, and the statistics still talk about these same exact inequities today. And that interested me. Also, I learned a little more about Connecticut. I know ultimately I know a lot hasn't been driven into, like, well, who was Connecticut as it relates to the transatlantic slave trade and slavery? We talk a lot about the South, but who was the North? I learned a lot about Connecticut relative to the story. I learned that, Middletown was a port town, and ships would leave in and out of Middletown on that journey to the west coast of Africa to get the enslaved people, go to the West Indies to sell them. They would even double dip. There were farmers in Middletown that would take their crops and sail to the West Indies to sell them to the enslavers there as the feed for the enslaved. So Middletown was steeped in this. I also learned in finding this article in the Litchfield Inquirer, post the Civil War, like we're talking September 1865, it was put up for a vote for Connecticut citizens to determine whether or not they should remove the word white from the requirement to vote in this state. And there were a lot of editorials in the Connecticut Current and other newspapers across the state at the time, trying to urge the public as to why they should or shouldn't vote to have that occur. Most were why they should vote to not remove the word white. And the reasons they would give are Connecticut voters felt that blacks might feel equal. These are right from the articles. They might feel they might elect Negroes. They didn't want that. That was scary to Connecticut citizens. Again, this is post-Civil War. They felt that Connecticut citizens felt that blacks might become intimate friends with white men. They felt that blacks might intermarry with white women. And so these were published things in the newspaper, and therefore that whole thing failed. Connecticut voted to not allow black men to vote. Interestingly enough, my second great grandfather, Ned Mills, of which I get my surname, was not in the North, right? He was in Texas, in the South, hidden under, behind this whites only cemetery, buried unmarked. Yet when the Civil War ended, as a requirement for the Confederate States to rejoin the Union, they had to register all eligible men to vote by September 1st, 1867. And therefore, my second great grandfather, Ned Mills, I have the copy of him being registered to vote on July 24th, 1867. The interesting point here is, had he been in Connecticut, that couldn't have happened, because Connecticut wouldn't have given him the right to vote until the 15th Amendment in 1870. So it kind of gives you a different perspective. For me, I see slavery as a symptom of colorism, right? The idea that someone is less value because of the color of their skin then gives you what you believe and the autonomy to then treat them different and then force labor on them. And while slavery had ended in Connecticut, colorism had not, the root of the issue, right? And I think that is still an ongoing issue across our country. I think that's still something we're battling. Um, Also, with regards to the story, as I talked about earlier, like the people that I'm related to are not the celebrated. They were not the exceptionalists. They were the people that persisted, and the only reason I'm here, they persisted through all of this and were never celebrated. Yet they continued to reproduce, and I now exist. So those are the people I celebrate. Here in Connecticut, I hear a lot about like that same perspective of um, the exceptionalist story, and I saw that as I heard the story of Venture Smith here in Connecticut, where he purchased his freedom, and after purchasing his freedom, he gains wealth. And it's an amazing story. He was captured off the coast of Guinea, and he saw his father killed, and then he eventually gets here, and it takes him years. He gets out of slavery, purchases his way out, and then he purchases his family's way out. But what I find most interesting about that story is that there's two sides to that coin. The second being that I see Prince Mortimer as the same person as Venture Smith. And that's what this grid is kind of reflecting. They were born around the same time. They both are from Guinea. They both were enslaved around the same time. They both ultimately were enslaved in the Connecticut colony, and they both had statements about their experience through the Middle Passage. They both had 3 children. Venture was enslaved by 4 people. Prince was enslaved by at least 3. And they both were promised their freedom. The only disparity I see is Venture's was realized. And that enslaver didn't want to do it. He said it, and then he didn't do it. Then he charged him more, and Venture, had to force a sale, and then there was a lot that went into that. His freedom was eventually realized. Prince's was not. It was promised, but they just never really was realized. And that's when their paths kind of divert. But I still see him as the exact same person. Venture was never in prison. Prince was when he trying to fight to get his freedom. He then was in prison. We know exactly where Venture is buried, but now we don't know where Prince is. He likely was, either his bones are still kept somewhere or he was discarded. We don't know anything about it. But that story makes me think that we should likely be highlighting and celebrating and acknowledging that other side of the quarry, not just Venture Smith. So I did a lot more research and discovered where Prince worked, where that rope walk was that he worked at. And it's at a location, a building that no longer exists. Another building exists there now. But I found a 1783 map at the Connecticut State Library that showed me where that was. So now I had the location, and I was able to get a current day address of where that location was, where Prince Mortimer worked all those years. I also was able to get a location of Philip Mortimer, the enslaver's house, which became the son-in-law's house after the enslaver died, and is the location where Prince was accused of attempting to poison that son-in-law by putting arsenic in his morning chocolate. The son-in-law never drank it. He just made an accusation. For all I know, there was no arsenic in there. We don't know. But that accusation is then what put him in jail for life at age 87. And I found the location based on this map of that particular home. Unfortunately, that home doesn't exist there anymore either. It was torn down. But a historian in Middletown, Debbie Shapiro, she pointed me in the direction of a book, a 1901 book by the descendant of a person who owned that home years after Philip Mortimer had passed away. And that in that book, that descendant had taken pictures of the book. And they're the first pictures I had ever seen of that walkway. I'll back up. You see there's a long walkway here that shows where Prince would have had to walk to go to work every day. He would have made a left here, which would have then taken him down the street to this rope walk. And the first picture I ever saw on the right there was that walkway. And so now I had a picture of it. And on the left is that house that Prince Mortimer lived in as an enslaved individual all of those years. Um, so in working with the Connecticut Freedom Trail and Tammy Denise and Todd Levine and all the wonderful people there, they were able to work with me to get some of these locations on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and they also got me in contact with a developer who's developing out affordable housing and office space on the location where the rope walk used to be. I met with him. His name is J.R. Carnegie Hargraves. He's an amazing individual. He's gung ho and ready to work with me to honor Prince Mortimer in this redevelopment effort. So at some point we'll have murals, and there's going to be an area called Prince Mortimer Park, and there will be plaques at that location. Also, in working with Public Works Department in Middletown, they seem ready and willing. I spoke at one of their meetings to change the name of Rapallo Avenue in Middletown, which is the location of where that walkway used to be, where Prince Mortimer walked every day to work. And the idea here is to change the name of that street to Prince Mortimer Avenue. All seems to be positive there. Fingers crossed that gets done. So we're really excited about that. Some other individuals that, aside from just Prince Mortimer, I'm also working on an effort of some of the individuals of the colored regiments of Connecticut. I went down to New Haven and visited the Connecticut 29th Colored Regiment Monument, and it's a fascinating monument. I loved it. It's amazing to see it. One thing that struck me, though, is an individual I had been researching. His name was Nicholas Monroe, also who was incarcerated at Wethersfield Prison, died there, and there are newspaper articles that his body was dug up and sent to Yale as well, that we're now trying to validate whether that was true, but our guard is saying that he was dug up and sent to Yale. But he enlisted, Nicholas Monroe enlisted in the 29th, was pushed into the 30th, which then became the 31st, right? And but when I go to this monument in New Haven, he's not on that monument. Yet he's on the African American Civil War monument in Washington, D.C., right? And that's what you see on the left, his name on that monument wall. So he's being honored in Washington, but not here in Connecticut. And that's when I realized that the monument in New Haven has 900 of the 1,700 African Americans that actually enlisted in one of those three regiments. And so now I'm interested in figuring out, why are there 800 people or not listed there? What were the reasonings behind that monument only having 900 names? A descendant of another individual by the name of Charles Seeley contacted me as I was doing that work and had the same question, because their descendant enlisted in the 29th and is not on that wall in New Haven. And I dug into Charles Seeley, and sure enough, I was able to see his name on the wall in the African American Civil War Monument in Washington, D.C., yet he's not really acknowledged in Connecticut, where he lived all his life, where he died. Right. So interesting. I'm really digging into those stories now to figure that whole thing out. Also, another individual that I'm digging into is an individual by the name of the man Fortune, who was an enslaved man in Waterbury. He died in supposedly accidentally in Waterbury. His enslaver, Dr. Preserve Porter, then where he died at the side of a body of water, cut him into pieces at the water side, took him back to his home, boiled his bones so the flesh fell off, reticulated the bones, and started using them to train people to be bone doctors. And that went on for 3 generations of his family. They were eventually donated to the Mattituck Museum. At the Mattituck Museum, they hung there from the 1930s all the way up to 1970, when they finally took the bones down. But in 1999, the bones were brought back out for study, and eventually he was buried at Riverside Cemetery on September 13th, 2013. And so I'm digging into him as well to kind of get a better understanding of what his life was like, what really happened with him, a perspective, again, from a descendant of the enslaved's perspective, like who's telling these stories and what is important when they look at them. And so I'm interrogating this story too. I'm also trying to work with the city to change the name of William Street in Waterbury to Fortune Street, after him, which is the corner of East Main and William, where Fortune's residence was. So I'm working on all those things. If you want to know more about any of the projects that I'm working at, please feel free to go to alexbrienne.org. That's my 501c3 website where I post all the information on the individuals that I'm interrogating. And with that, I'll leave it open for questions. Thanks a lot.
Oh my goodness, John. Thank you so very much. Very intriguing information. I do have a question. What has been the most valuable resource of info during your research?
Well, the most valuable information. I don't know. I don't know if I don't know if I can pinpoint an individual uh, element. Um, I guess I could tell you like the most valuable action for me has been the willingness, first of all, not to time box myself. I think as soon as I time box myself, you kind of limit your ability to grab information, and thus you kind of limit your ability to tell the actual story. So I don't do that. I don't time box it. I work it until I can get as detailed as I can get. And number two, I'm willing to travel and do whatever is necessary to kind of get to the details of the story. I think those have been the most valuable attributes that have helped me along this journey. But most valuable piece of information, I don't know. I think they're all been like incredible.
Awesome. The next question would be, because you have done such research and you worked it from your grandparent, can you tell us what effect has historical trauma had on your research, and how does it impact the way you're doing your research?
Yeah, sure. Like what an interesting thing about it is people hear those stories and they think, "Oh, wow, that might set your mind or your mood back." What it actually did for me is it raised my shoulders up. Like what I saw in it, it completely ingrained me into this country's history. Right? It gave me a power and a pride. Like these people are heroes to me. Right? They endured. So I think it gave me that. Also, I grew up in the '70s, around Panther folks that were like were influenced by the Panthers and the US organization, and those were the people that were raising me, right? And so, and I saw a lot of racism up close and personal, and I had to translate a lot of that after it happened. When you're a kid, you don't know what it is, but I'm older and then I can reflect and go, well, that's what that was. And so I think researching this information gives me I think I have a different perspective, I think, than many may have. And also it allows me to interrogate the information I'm finding with my experience to somehow figure out a way to get, good, God fearing, um, well-meaning people to reflect, look in the mirror, and find out whether or not they're a part of holding up any current day pillars of bias and colorism. So I think there's a positive effect to all of it.
Oh, awesome. Now, let me ask this question. In regards to language and learning how we need to focus on language and how we need to see that language makes a difference in the work that we're doing. Talk about colorism a little bit, because growing up in the South, never knew what it was, but always felt the pangs of being the darker ones. I had a cousin, his name was Rene. He and I were the darkest in our family. We were always ostracized because we were too black, we were too dark. And you know it hurt, you knew that it wasn't a good feeling, but you never knew exactly why until we finally got that label, that tag, colorism. And then suddenly it made more sense. It still hurt like heck, but it made more sense as to why it was happening and what it was. So how do you feel about that?
Well, that's an important topic to me. And first of all, I just want to celebrate you for a minute, give you your flowers, because a lot of the language you're teaching me. I hear you kind of correct me and give me information that I didn't know. So I appreciate you for that often. But relative to like colorism, that's a this, like a subject of pain to a lot of African Americans, because I think we were all taught the bias of colorism. whether you're white or black. Like anybody here, you come up in this system. What you see, what you saw in media, what you saw in leadership, who you saw of importance, there was a colorism aspect that told you whether you were valued or you weren't. Right.
Exactly.
So we were all impacted by that. And so often in my professional career, impacts to me of bias. A lot of times they were white Americans, but often they were black Americans. Because
Mhm.
we're also doing the same thing, demeaning based on color. We were all taught colorism. So yeah, I think that in my family, my father was very fair skinned. For years it was like, oh, we have Native American in our family, and of course, my sister and I find out years later that it's because all these Irish men were raping all these enslaved people. That's why he came out fair skinned, and he talked about how he was treated within his family as a child because he was so fair skinned, and other members of my family, in a black community, but he's so fair skinned. He talked about what that meant and the pains of that. My father talked about wanting to scratch his skin off of his face because of that, right?
Mhm.
And then I have darker family members who talk about the opposite and the things that happen to them because they're so dark. That's a critical topic. So whenever I see that, especially when I saw that in that initial book by Richard Phelps, an average person reading that may not have noticed that they're
Mhm.
pinpointing that Prince Mortimer is dark as night. But for
Mhm.
a person who's felt the pain of it all of their life,
Exactly.
you see
Exactly.
that line, right?
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think that's an important topic to get out, and I'm still working on how to articulate that and get people to kind of understand what that is and recognize that you may have that in your head, even though you don't know you have it in your head,
That
because that's
unconscious
what we were
bias.
all taught, and you may be
Mhm.
acting on that, and because you're acting on that, you may be affecting people. You may be a part of holding up the pillars of this thing, even though you find yourself and feel yourself as being an advocate. So I ask myself questions every day with every action I take so that I'm cognizant of not doing that. It's a work effort. It's a daily
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah, decolonization definitely is a verb that's in action, and it has to have action in order to continue breaking down the tentacles of white supremacy. And colorism is definitely a tentacle of such a thing. Thank you so much for giving me my flowers. I appreciate that. That's kind. And I like the fact that you feel that I'm teaching you about the language. So
Oh,
thank you.
absolutely,
We're in this
absolutely.
together. We all have a role to play, and some of us are better in some other areas than others. But when we come together, that's what makes it so much easier, and it makes it worthwhile to continue trying to get this history out there and let people know that we come from a strong, resilient background. And a lot of times, the Black and African American community don't want to hear our history because of the way it was taught, that one-sided lens. But today we're telling our own narratives, and we're telling them from our side and how we see things. I always use that saying, the victor gets to tell the story. But if you're telling the story from the victor's point of view, but the lion is the enemy, but if you tell the story from the lion's point of view, it's like they were chasing me, they were trying to kill me, what was I supposed to do? So it's a whole different view. So I really truly appreciate all of the work that you are doing and that you continue to do, because it is necessary and it is so very important. I really appreciate you and I admire what you do. So please don't stop, and we are in this together. So, my friend, I thank you so very much for coming on today and for sharing this with us. And definitely we'll have you back to get an update on the name changing of Rapallo Avenue. We're gonna be positive it's gonna happen. It's
It's
gonna
gonna
happen.
happen. It's gonna
We're gonna
happen.
print his
Can I
flowers.
can I say one last thing? I think that historically, a lot of us, as African American, a person of African descent in this country, we've not been taught, our history, and in the past, a lot of our personal history is kind of lost because of the way the enslaver documented, or the lack of documentation and their ability to not document it. And I think a lot of us have kind of grown accepting of just knowing little. But there's a power in getting deep into understanding who you are, who you came from, and who those people are, that I don't know how to articulate. So I just encourage anyone who hasn't done that to dig into their own genealogy.
Thank you, John. Before you go, we have a few questions on the screen. I'm having technical difficulty on my side. So behind the scenes, you're going to bring them up so that we can answer them. So just hold on one moment. It says, when the doctors told the prison that Prince needed better food, they really did it. Did they really care? And did the hospital really care or follow up? And I realized this is implied answers or answers that may be inferred. So did they
Yeah.
follow up?
Yeah. So what happened was, prior to the investigation into the prison, there was no attending physician, and there weren't people in the hospital like logging any of this information. So the reason we have those 2 or so years of documentation was because that was a dictation from the committee assigned from the state to oversee the prison. Right. So it really isn't the prison now. This is really the government saying, who are these people? What are you doing? People are dying at your prison. So, and that's why they're kind of, those logs are the doctors operating outside of the prison. They're going, this person's in here dying because they ain't getting fed the right food. This person right here, stomach is hurting because he just ate some spoiled food. This is them reporting on the prison.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they had to follow up. Right. So yeah,
Gotcha.
they
Now, do we know, even though they may have followed up, did they actually do something about it? Was something actually done about it? Maybe in the
yeah.
immediate, but was it long term?
Yeah, they did something about it. They dug a new well, so now there wasn't this spoiled well with bad water. And then they audited them because the warden was stealing food. That's why the prisoners were getting all kinds of bad food, and so they followed up. But the same problem then resurfaced like a 20 or 30 years later. Another warden, like Wethersfield, was historic for having these corrupt wardens. So
Mm,
it resurfaced. But
yeah.
at that given time, they
Mhm.
followed up.
Got you. All right. There's a couple more. We're trying to get them to come up, so just hang on with us, please. I'm having technical difficulties on my side. Was there a trial when Prince was accused of poisoning his owner? Another question from Andre Kidd.
Yeah, there was, and it all occurred, ironically, in August. Right, he was accused on August 5th of 1811, and but he wasn't actually sentenced to Newgate until December. So he sat in prison, for those 4 months, and the trial occurred during those 4 months. So there was a trial. But the interesting thing again about it, a couple things, is in 1811 is also the same year of the largest slave revolt in American history, and so enslavers were like fearful that somebody was going to kill them in their sleep. So this enslaver may have just had that fear, even though Prince had never done anything in all the years he had been enslaved there. He may have just been in fear, which is the reason he accused him. And also, just a reminder, this guy wasn't part of local politics, local religion, and he funded all that stuff. All right, and local law enforcement. So I mean,
Wow.
I don't know. I don't know what did Prince have behind him to even fight that.
It's safe to say he had nothing because the tentacles of white supremacy was there on all levels, and that's why that institution, we have to play our part in tearing it down, but we can't tear it down. That's why we need the advocates and the allies to recognize that you're not to blame for it, but you still benefit from it, and you're the ones that have to help it to be brought down. There's a question about the monument from Mr. Warren Barnett. In the case of the monument in Fairhaven, a few towns were omitted during the subcontracting process. When a job is bidded out, then subcontracted from their information, some of their information is lost. My great 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 grandfather, Sergeant Empson Brown, Connecticut 29th, of the Colored Connecticut Regiment, was omitted from the monument due to lack of attention, and as a result, the town of Suffield, which is where he signed, was not placed on the monument. So all men of color who joined were also omitted from the monument. Wow. So we see
Right.
here.
Right. And it aligns to kind of my own personal story, right, of my third great grandfather who served in the Civil War, but now he's not at a military cemetery. He's like under like a parking lot. And so now I'm in Connecticut, and I see a monument, and I know 1,700 men enlisted, African or men of color enlisted in the 29th, 30th, or 31st, but we have a monument that only lists 900 or 1,700 men. For me, if I was a descendant of those other 800 people, I would be looking for the name somewhere, especially in the state where they were. If I can go to DC and see them, I'd want them here in Connecticut. So that's where my work is now, to not only figure out like why aren't they there, but figure out a way to honor these other 800 people.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we have, oh my goodness, all of a sudden a whole bunch of things just popped up. From Kelvin Williams, where was Weathersfield Prison located and what area of Weathersfield?
Exactly at the spot of Weathersfield DMV. That one of the buildings that are a part of Weathersfield DMV is a building that was a part of the prison. So you're literally on the grounds of the Weathersfield prison if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles in Weathersfield, Connecticut. And again, right literally butted up against it is a park where you'll see people playing, field hockey and soccer and softball. And at the back of
Yes.
that field is where was the prison cemetery. There were two cemeteries. One is lost. And that's where we originally thought Prince Mortimer was buried until we discovered he was likely sent to Yale.
Okay, I know. Give me a few more minutes, John, because these questions just popped up, and I really want to give them their attention. As a Black man doing this research, what is your emotional or personal state whilst uncovering the treachery of the institution of slavery? So, how does this affect you as you're doing this? Sort of like
Well,
that comment.
yeah, I think when you initially, like when you first start and you initially see like these things, right? You need a moment, right? You gotta like, wait a minute,
Oh yeah.
my people are the blood was where they were
Mm-hmm.
they suffered, but then you start to like take those stories that are presented in our country as I think they're not given the appropriate grandeur.
Right.
You don't see them as the common. You see it as a story. But
Mm-hmm.
I we went down, we started walking down three lines in my family, and all three of them end have a rape or have a person who was segregated in woods or under a park. I mean, it wasn't hard to find. Every line had that. And so you what I learned from it was we all likely have the same stories. I'm not unique. We all likely have all the same stories, and it told me that our country, there's clearly some a gap there in how we're actually educating our people and
Mm-hmm.
how and what they know about the commonality of these stories that have been presented as if they weren't so common. Like
Exactly.
so it kind of gives me a vigor to ensure that we all know that this isn't just a story about Prince Mortimer or Venture or my story. This is all of our stories. All of this stuff is us. You do
Yeah.
your own history, you're gonna find the same thing. So it just
Exactly.
gives me a vigor.
Exactly. Kelvin Williams says, thanks for sharing this with us. And then Miss Marta Daniel says, John, thank you for this amazing journey with your family and critical informed interest. Learned so much. I'm trying to make sure I got all of the comments and questions. I think I finally got them all, John. I think I saw them all. Well, again, my friend, I appreciate you being here today. Thank you for my flowers. I appreciate your hard work, and I hope that you continue to do so. And I look forward to you just coming back, giving us an update on all of your research. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone out there. I appreciate you being with us. And there's one more comment that just popped in. It says, from Ariel Brockwell, I appreciate the amount of research you've uncovered so far in order to share the information. Thank you for presenting, John. So that's from Ariel Brockwell.
Appreciate
Um,
you, Ariel.
Again, everyone, thank you so very much for being with us today. Join us next month, Tuesday, September 26th, the fourth Tuesday of the month, where we are going to learn more about the 29th Regiment. It is the 31st of Private Leverett Holden. He was of the Connecticut 29th Regiment of the U.S. Civil War with Terry Wilson. Then October 24th, the fourth Tuesday in October, the making of the first Black U.S. diplomat with William Fothergill. Tuesday, November 28th, another good friend of mine, Mr. Joseph McGill, Sleeping with the Ancestors. It is talking about the educational value of sleeping in slave dwellings. So thank you all so very much for joining us. I hope that you will complete your surveys. Let us know how we're doing. Let us know what else you would like to see. And again, until the next time.